We're going to talk about a personality trait, which is agreeableness in one end of the distribution, and something sometimes called antagonism on the other end. It's a difficult trait to conceptualize, in my estimation. It's always been the one that's puzzled me the most in some ways. And I also think it's the one that gets most obviously troublesome at both ends of the spectrum. So, extremely agreeable people are empathetic and compassionate and compliant. But the downside of that is that they are not that good at standing up for themselves, and so they're often manipulated and pushed around. For example, they're not as good at negotiating for their own salaries. And that's something we'll discuss in a little bit. And my experience clinically has been that agreeable people, the consequence of their compliance is that they tend to be resentful. Because just because you're agreeable and compliant doesn't mean that at some level of your psyche you're not interested in a fair deal. And if you're not particularly good at negotiating for yourself, especially in the presence of disagreeable or antagonistic people, then you're going to be left with the short end of the stick. I think the typical complaint of someone who's very agreeable is, I do so much for other people and they seem to do so little for me. And so if you feel that way, there's a reasonable probability that you're agreeable. There's some probability that you're too agreeable, and maybe you should stop being so easy to get along with. And that's one possibility. On the other end of the distribution, the antagonistic end, well, if you're antagonistic enough, you end up in prison. It's the best personality predictor of antisocial behavior. It seems to be associated with sort of cold-blooded aggression rather than the reactive form, which would be more characteristic of negative emotion, neuroticism. So, and I think that people who are lower in agreeableness or higher antagonism are probably predatory. Now, human beings are predators, and we have been for a huge swath of our evolutionary history, maybe for all of it, maybe not when we were one-celled animals, but for a huge chunk of it. And during that time, our capacity to be predators has definitely been key to our survival. Women aren't after resources. That's wrong. They're after the factors that predict resources. So what we did was we showed women a bunch of pictures. It was this, say several pictures of the same guy. So there was several guys. And each guy was in 4 conditions. The photo of each guy was in 4 conditions. Same photo, right? So one guy was poor and stupid, poor and useless. One guy was rich and useless. One guy was rich and useful. And one guy was poor and useful. So the rich, useless guy had won a lottery, and it paid out like $4,000 a month for the rest of his life. So no matter how useless he was, he couldn't squander all of it. He had resources, right? The poor, useless guy, well, we don't even have to define that. Everybody understands that. The rich, useful guy, well, that's easy to understand. The poor, useful guy worked for a non-governmental agency. It was a charity, in a charitable organization. And so he had high occupational status but low income, and that wasn't likely to change. So then we asked women to rate these men on a bunch of different attributes. And including personality, but also on dateability, basically, and also on probability of considering a long-term relationship with someone like this. And wealth had no main effect. The only effect was usefulness. So the poor useful guy and the rich useful guy were attractive, more attractive to the women than the two useless guys, regardless of their socioeconomic status. And the women judged the useful guys as higher in openness and conscientiousness, which was pretty smart, because openness is basically intelligence and conscientiousness is hard work, and those are the best predictor of socioeconomic success. So yay women, good work. Any other questions?
So what do men look for in women? Like just appearance?
No, it's not exactly appearance, it's more like signs of health. And that's associated, and it isn't even that. The things that have made women attractive to men across time are the things that are associated with health and therefore reproductive capacity. So for example, waist to hip ratio is a marker. 0.68 seems to be about ideal. Why? Well, it turns out that women who have a higher, I can't figure it out at the moment, more waist than hips are more likely to die, for example, of cardiovascular disease. It's an unhealthy distribution of body fat for women. And so that seems to be a negative fitness marker. And then symmetry, for example. I mean, women like symmetrical men too, don't get me wrong. But men are more attracted, say, to physical health than women. One of the markers for physical health is also symmetry, and that's associated with beauty. Clear skin, all these things are associated with health and youthfulness. Yeah, and that's pretty much that. Female criteria, all respondents. Correlation between socioeconomic status and frequency of simultaneous partners. For men it was 0.49. That's a big correlation. For women it was 0.04. That's zero, fundamentally. So the correlation between male socioeconomic status and frequency of simultaneous partners is 0.5. It's a huge effect. For women, it's zero. Now that's a big difference. So, you know, one of the things you might ask yourself too, I don't know if this is a reasonable thing to ask or not, but I've always thought that the hard people to explain are the people who are hyperachievers, you know, the ones who are way out on the Pareto distribution. And there aren't very many of them, and they're usually men. You know, so if you look at the median number of publications, for example, that a female academic makes and a male academic, they're pretty much the same. But the mean for men is higher, and that's all driven by a small subset of men who are way the hell out in the Pareto distribution. Now you might ask, well, why is that? Well, it's simple. If you want to be way out on the Pareto distribution, so you're in the top, say, 1% of performers, or even 1/10 of 1% of performers, what do you have to do? Well, first, having an IQ of like 145 or above, that's really helpful. Then you should be insanely industrious. So maybe you'll work 90 hours a week, or 100 hours a week, at nothing but your stupid occupation. And maybe you'll do that for like 50 years. And so if you do that, well, you're going to be in that top 1 in 1,000 category. Well, the issue isn't why there are so few women in that category. The issue is, why are there any men at all in that category? Right? Because it's an insane lifestyle in many ways. You know, it means that there isn't much left there for the rest of your life. You're hyper-concentrating on a single thing. Now, why would men do that? Well, here's a hypothesis. One of the things that drives the probability that a woman will find a man attractive enough to sleep with is his status. So then you can think, well, that's an extra motivational boost for men. Now, whether that's conscious motivational boost or not is not the point. The question is it a boost that might have been instantiated as an evolutionary element of general motivation? Well, men are more competitive, they're more disagreeable, and if they're more disagreeable and more competitive, they seem to do better, especially in high-status jobs, and then women are more likely to pick men like that for sexual partners, so at some point it becomes difficult to avoid the conclusion, especially since we know that the men on the way out on the tail end of the Pareto distribution are disproportionately likely to sleep with many women. So Warren Beatty, I think, 15,000, that was his estimate, 15,000 women. And Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the basketball player, he figured 10,000. So for every one guy who's got those numbers racked up, that's 10,000 guys who don't. So the male success distribution is extreme, and it's associated with outlier success in some important dimension of socioeconomic success, and then female reproductive opportunity is not. So, you know, is that relevant? Well, you know, it depends on how you think. It's hard for me to see that it can't be relevant. So, questions? You had a question?
Like, so what that means is the higher the job, like the higher their status, the more partners they have? Oh.
Yep. Yep, absolutely. And like this is a single study, but this data is common. Now, there's some interesting correlates of this. So, for example, you might say, why are males much more likely to engage in homicide? And Daly and Wilson figured this out a long while back, and what they showed was a very, very cool study. They took the level of income inequality in each county in the US and in Canada, and then they correlated that with the homicide rate. And what they found was that the higher the rate of inequality, so the more people at the bottom and the fewer people at the top, the higher the male homicide rate. And the correlation was 0.8, something like that, 0.85. It was like, it's the whole reason. So what happens is that when the competition between men gets intense because hardly anyone can win, then males start to kill each other. Now, Martin and Daly also tried to figure out if that was a good idea, so they studied Chicago. And what they found was, well, most male-on-male homicides are young men, and a lot of them, they're within race, and they're often in dominance disputes. It's like, you know, maybe it's a gang thing. And it's like, well, you shoot me or I'll shoot you. It's like, who's victim and who's perpetrator is not that obvious. So what happens in Chicago? Well, typically, the charge is plea bargained down to self-defense. Then, no one's willing to testify against the guy because, well, after all, he just shot someone. And then he's in prison for 2 years because that's the sentence. And then he's out in 18 months if he behaves reasonably well. So then he's killed someone and he's back on the street. And guess what? His status has increased substantially. So you can think about it as a... But if I lay down and I play dead and I stay dead, maybe you'll get sick of being the monster out of my head, under my bed, think you're something out of my nightmares, standing right there. But if I lay down and I play dead and I stay dead, then will you get bored of killing me? Silhouettes of you are like a taunt. Never really know just what you want. With you I don't ever feel calm. I can feel the sweat inside my palms. Play with me like cats and a string. You don't understand the pain it brings. You don't ever wanna give me wings. You don't ever wanna set me free. You know I'm addicted to you, and it's twisted, you've been gifted with the evil voodoo. Got me coming back for more, even when I've been screwed. Dolls full of pins, pierce my heart straight through. I got issues in my head, I like you in my bed, but you keep me on red. Oh, everything is like a test, I better not text or I'll come off desperate. But if I lay down and I play dead and I stay dead, baby you'll get sick of being the monster out of my head, under my bed, think you're something out of my nightmares, standing right there. But if I lay down and I play dead and I stay dead, then will you get bored of killing me? So if I play dead, will you regret everything that you did, that you said? I don't think you understand what you're doing, and my heart's black and blue from the bruising. I feel like when I'm with you I'm losing. I feel like you think that this amusing, sitting there gaslighting and confusing. Was it me? Is it me? Am I deluded? I'm the one who's always sorry, the conclusion, even though I offer all of the solutions. I wish you loved me like I love you, it's stupid. When I'm alone with you I never feel lucid. I wish I wasn't struck by Cupid. I wish when I first saw you I knew this. When I'm with you I feel so useless, I feel diluted, my heart's been wounded. Silhouettes of you are like a taunt.
Never really know just what you want. With you I don't ever feel calm. I can feel the sweat inside my palm. Play with me like cats and a string. You don't understand the pain it brings. You don't ever wanna give me wings. You don't ever wanna set me free.
But if I lay down and I play dead and I stay dead, baby you'll get sick of being the monster out of my head, under my bed, thinking something out of my nightmares. See me right there. But if I lay down and I play dead and I stay dead, then will you get bored of killing me? Then will you get bored of killing me? And will you get bored of killing me? And will you get bored of killing me? And will you get bored of killing me?
Socioeconomic/sexual decision. And we also know that as economic disparity grows, the social stability decreases. And the reason for that seems to be, well, mostly seems to be male-on-male aggression. And so what I think probably happens is that if there's a fair bit of chance for men to climb the ladder, then only the most disagreeable of them become violent. But as you crank down on the opportunities so that the competition gets more and more intense, the level of disagreeableness that it takes in order to catalyze aggression the level of disagreeableness that it takes to catalyze aggression starts to decrease. Until, if it gets so intense that there's no possibility for status, then the whole bloody society is going to flip over. Because the guys at the bottom, who are like all the guys, are going to decide that this is a stupid game, and they'd rather flip the board over and, you know, set the markers to 0 and see how they come up in the new society. So, it's possible that one of the things that motivates revolutions in human society is excessive inequality. And the reason that that's a problem is because it's so tightly linked to male reproductive opportunity. So